Warning, if you work in a prudish company, some parts of this video might be considered not safe for work. But if you're at work, why the heck are you watching this thing? Get back to those spreadsheets, you lazy bum. Oh, Japan, you do make a lot of weird games, don't you? But you do know that we all love you for it, so why do you keep so many of them to yourselves? Sure, we do get to partake in your madness sometimes, but for every Katamari and Hatoful boyfriend that gets localized, there's always something else that English-speaking gamers will be left out of. And one of those things we got left out of was the Cho Aniki series. In Japan, this franchise is a cult classic, but very few people outside of Japan know about it. And of the few people that do know about it, many simply dismiss it as that one gay shoot-em-up game. And while yes, these games certainly have an appreciation for the male form, I still think describing the franchise like that is doing it a disservice. The games do have some suggestive imagery, but it's used more for comedic effect and it's certainly not erotic. Okay, maybe I'm not the leading authority here since I'm just a boring vanilla straight guy, but I'm pretty darn sure that very few gay dudes, or straight women for that matter, will find anything in these games to be sexy. And simply dismissing it as gay also negates all the other cool and quirky things this franchise has done, both in terms of gameplay and style. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the actual games now. The first game in the series, simply titled Cho Aniki, was originally released in Japan in 1992, exclusively for the PC Engine CD, or as it's known in the West, the TurboGrafx CD. But don't fret if you don't have a TurboGrafx CD, because at the time of this recording, this game is actually available in America and Europe as a Wii Virtual Console import game. The game is still in Japanese, but since it's a shoot-em-up you don't really need to do any reading. The only thing you'll really miss is the story, and I think that would actually be more confusing if you could read it. There's really not a lot of information about these games online, but from what I've been able to gather, you play as two gods who have descended from heaven in order to fight an evil alien overlord. An evil alien overlord who also happens to be a bodybuilder who wants to turn every planet in the universe into a protein factory. So yeah, maybe it's best for your sanity that you can't read the story. As wacky as the rest of the game is, the actual gameplay of Cho Aniki is pretty standard for a shooter though. As I mentioned, you have two different characters, but they both play pretty much the same. The only real difference I've found is the super move, which you activate by holding down the attack button. The male character Idaten has a powerful laser that does heavy damage to anything in front of him, while the female character Benten has a spread shot that does less damage but hits a wider area. But other than that, both characters are pretty interchangeable. Apart from this, you also have your traditional screen clearing bombs and options. But really, in terms of gameplay, there's not a lot here that you haven't seen in a million other shooters. That's not to say it's not well made though, it's actually really good, it's just not anything you haven't seen before. But make no mistake about it, the true reason to play Cho Aniki is for the presentation. Now, the graphics in this first game hasn't quite reached the wackiness singularity that some of the later games in the series would. But there's still more than enough bizarre imagery to give the artist a free pass should he ever need to make a plea for insanity. My favorite part is definitely the bosses, which includes things like a mecha harp and a biomechanical Elvis Presley warship. Oh yeah, and those options I mentioned earlier. You know, in your average shooter the options are either a tiny spaceship or an energy ball or something. But yeah, Cho Aniki is far from the average shooter, isn't it? So here you get alien bodybuilders in speedos instead. But if there's one part of the game that's even more amazing than the graphics, it would have to be the music. The soundtrack is just as bizarre as the rest of the game. But it's also really awesome, and I can almost guarantee that you have never heard game music quite like this before. If you want to try the Cho Aniki series, the original is a great place to start. In terms of gameplay, it's still one of the best games in the series, and since it's on the virtual console, it's also one of the easiest games in the series to get a hold of outside of Japan. Next up for the franchise was Cho Aniki, again for the TurboGrafx/PC Engine CD. In this game you play as Samson and Aidan, you know, the two clothing-deprived bodybuilders that served as options in the last game. This game is still a shoot 'em up, but it's a far less traditional one than the original Cho Aniki. In fact, this is the only game in the series where the gameplay gets close to being as bizarre as the presentation. If you just press the fire button, you can shoot a normal bullet that will home in on the closest enemy. But you can also perform several different special moves by combining the fire button with different D-pad combinations. Pretty much like how special moves work in fighting games. This really sounds like it should be a disaster when combined with the precision required from a shoot-em-up game. But you'd be surprised how well it works once you get used to it, which you actually do pretty quickly. You also have a defensive move in form of a spin which makes you temporarily invincible. This feature is really important since you're also a lot bigger than the average shoot-em-up character. Don't expect this to make the game easy though. Even with the pretty generous invincibility that the spin gives you, you'll still have a hard time dodging all the stuff the game throws at you. Even the game's lives system is pretty bizarre. You have a pretty standard life bar with 3 hits, but you don't have any traditional extra lives. Instead you have hourglasses that serve both as timers and extra lives. If you run completely out of hourglasses, it's game over and you don't get any continues. But you do get a pretty generous amount of them, and you can get more by beating levels or collecting power-ups. If I'm being completely honest, I think I would have preferred a more traditional live system. But it was an interesting experiment at least, and it by no means ruins the game. On the presentation side, this game balances out its predecessor quite nicely. The music is not quite as fantastic as the amazing soundtrack of the original, but it is still really good. And inversely, the graphics have taken a noticeable step forward. It's noticeably more detailed and the series' trademark style gets an even bigger chance to shine this time. Sadly, Cho Aniki is a bit harder to get a hold of than its predecessor. It was released on the Virtual Console, but only in Japan this time. So you'll need either an original PC Engine copy or a Japanese Wii system if you want to play this one. But if you do get the chance, it is absolutely worth playing. The same year when Cho Aniki came out, we also got a game in the series for the Super Nintendo. Or perhaps I should say Super Famicom, since there was never a Western release. This game was known as Cho Aniki Bukuratsu Rantuhen. According to Wikipedia, this translates to Super Big Brother Exploding Brawl. But according to Google Translate, it means Chaotic Barking Lavatory. I think I'll leave it up to you to decide which one sounds most appropriate. Unlike its two predecessors, this game is not a shoot-em-up, but rather a one-on-one fighting game. Now, as you probably know, there were a lot of fighting games in the mid-90s, and a pretty huge chunk of them were not all that great. But this one actually falls on the good side of the spectrum. Sure, it's not as great as something like Street Fighter 2 or King of Fighters, but it's definitely a huge step above something like Balls 3D or Hey Punk, Are You Tough Enough? You get 8 different characters to choose from, most of them being player characters or bosses from the previous 2 games. The game uses a 4-button fighting system. You have a punch button, a kick button, a dash and a block. And each character also has a pretty good variety of different special moves. One of the more unique aspects of this game, as you have probably noticed from the video, is that all of the characters are flying. This means that you can move completely freely over the stage instead of being locked to just moving left or right like most fighting games. Another unique feature of this game is the stamina system. In addition to the life bar, each character also has a second meter that measures their stamina. This bar slowly refills over time, but you also drain it every time you use a special move. If the bar gets too low, you won't be able to use any special moves. And if you drain it all the way to the bottom, you can even be completely stunned for a couple of seconds. I have to say this is actually a pretty clever way to prevent players from spamming super moves all the time. Now, I have to admit the obscurity of this game did cause a bit of trouble for me. There's a couple of things in the game I don't quite understand, but after searching for more than an hour on the internet I just couldn't find any answers to these questions. Firstly, all of the characters have a special desperation laser attack. This will cause heavy damage but also completely drain your stamina bar. But I couldn't for the life of me figure out how to actually perform this attack. When playing single player, I also noticed that the computer recovered its stamina a lot faster than I did. But I have absolutely no idea if this is because something the computer player did or if it's just a built-in handicap to give the computer an advantage. But even if you like me can't figure out all the features to 100%, this is still an enjoyable fighting game. And since it still has that wacky Cho Aniki style, it's a great one to pull out if you have friends over and want to play something that's both a good laugh and a good game. Next up for the series was Cho Aniki. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce this subtitle, which came out for the PS1 and Sega Saturn. This one went back to the traditional shoot-em-up gameplay of the original Cho Aniki. The only real change to the gameplay is that the generic bombs from the original have been removed, and instead you collect protein which you can then spend to unlock different power-ups from a menu that you can scroll through with the L and R buttons. Sort of similar to the power-up system in the Gradius series, though here it's only used for one-off attacks instead of permanent upgrades. But while the game doesn't offer much innovation when it comes to the gameplay, there's certainly nothing quite like it when it comes to presentation. Instead of traditional 2D or 3D graphics, they decided to use digitized graphics for this game. You know, kind of like the original Mortal Kombat trilogy. Well, that is if the creators of Mortal Kombat had been tripping on acid in a man's locker room. Pretty much all of the sprites in the game are Cronenbergian combinations of muscular men and various objects and animal parts, which is simultaneously both disturbing and completely hilarious. This is probably the most famous game in the series outside of Japan, partly because of how incredibly bizarre it is of course, but mostly because the PS1 version is actually available on the European and American PSN store. The game has gained a bit of a reputation as one of those so bad it's good games, and while that's certainly true about the graphics, I don't think this is actually a bad game. Sure, it does have some problems, most notably that enemies and especially bosses can suck up a ton of bullets if you're not powered up. But that's true for a lot of shoot-em-up games, including ones that are considered timeless classics. Now, I should point out that I don't consider this one a timeless classic, at least not for the gameplay, but I do think it's a decently fun shoot-em-up game. And when you add the wonderfully bizarre presentation to that, you have a game that's at the very least well worthy of the $6 asking price on PlayStation Network. Next up in the series was Cho Aniki Otoko no Tamafuda. This game was released exclusively for the Bandai WonderSwan, but unfortunately I can't tell you a lot about it, and that's because this one is a Japanese RPG. Shooters and fighting games don't really require a lot of reading, but an RPG is a bit more tricky when you don't understand the language. And sadly, as far as I know, there's no unofficial translation either. From what I can tell, the game at least seems to keep in spirit with the rest of the franchise. Hopefully someone will release a translation at some point in the future, but for now let's move on to the next game. Cho Aniki Seinaru Protein Densetsu released for the PS2 in 2003. The gameplay this time is once again back to the classic shoot-em-up formula, and at first glance the gameplay itself might feel pretty generic. When you first start the game you get to choose the movement patterns of your options. Then you get the standard supply of screen-clearing bomb attacks, and you can also power up your basic shots by collecting protein dropped by defeated enemies. So far pretty standard shoot-em-up fare, right? But then you discover the greatest super attack of all time, the Men's Beam. By rotating the right thumbstick, Samson and Aiden, who once again serve as the game's options by the way, will start to gyrate very suggestively. Doing this will also charge up a meter at the bottom left of the screen. Then once you've filled up enough of it, just push down on the right stick and, well, see for yourself. Yep, like I said, best super attack ever. So now, what about the bread and butter of the Cho Aniki series, the graphics? Well, for the first time in the series, this game uses 3D graphics, and the results are, a mixed bag you might say. You do get some interesting anime designs, but most of the backgrounds are extremely generic. And I don't just mean that in the context of the Cho Aniki series. You do get some semi-wacky backgrounds in the latter half of the game, but at least 2/3 of them are completely void of charm and personality, and for this series that's a big problem. The same goes for the soundtrack as well. You get a couple of semi-silly tracks here and there, but for the most part it's just your average bombastic shooter music. This is still a fun and funny game, but it is a bit lacking compared to the older games in the series. And now, sadly, we're up to the last game in the Cho Aniki franchise, so far at least. And that game is Cho Aniki 0 for the PSP. Unlike all of the other games in the franchise, this one actually did get an English release in North America, though only as a PSN download. This game once again uses 3D graphics, but surprisingly, despite the inferior hardware, it actually looks a lot better than the PS2 game. Okay, it doesn't look as good technically, but it does do a much better job of capturing the Cho Aniki style, which is really the most important thing here. Despite this though, I find this to be the least enjoyable game in the franchise. This is not because the game plays poorly. It plays just as well as any other game in the series. In fact, it might even play better since they actually added a button to let you turn around this time. No, my problem is the difficulty. Sure, the older games were difficult too, but just in the same sense that most shooters are difficult. But this one enters full-on bullet hell territory. Now, I'm not a big fan of the bullet hell genre in general, but even if you are, I'm still not sure you'd enjoy this one. You see, the developers made the brilliant decision to make most of the power-ups and the enemy bullets the same color. So when most of the screen is filled with both power-ups and bullets, it's really easy for them to blend together. You do get unlimited continues, but that's a small consolation, because each level is divided into several stages, and each stage ends with a difficult boss battle. And if you get a game over, you have to start over from the first stage of the level. If you do enjoy punishing yourself, then this is at least a well-made and charming game, but it's not for me. And for the time being, that's the end of the Cho Aniki series. There was apparently also a mobile game in Japan back in the early 2000s. And there's also Gainung, aka Wings of War, which was made by the same team, and uses a similar art style, though in that game it was used more to be creepy than to be funny. But that's a story for another time. So have a good one, and I'll see you again in the next episode. And in the meantime, don't forget to do the muscle!